Yeah, we will change a bit louder.
That's for you, I think, isn't it? I think we should give them 5 minutes, shall we? 3 minutes, 4 minutes. Maybe they're all here.
Suggest we start. Welcome to the second of a series of 4 talks by Robert Skidelsky. We're really happy to have Professor Skidelsky here, who is Professor Emeritus at Warwick University. Many of you might know his biography of Keynes. And his new work is on the effects of AI. And the first talk was on, if I remember well, was on the future of work. And the second one is going to be on the quest for utopia. So with that, I think you're not here to listen to me. So with that, I'll hand over. It's roughly, the talk is about 1 hour, including the questions at the end. And there's a brief reception afterwards here right behind me. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you. People have always dreamt of utopia, remote from the troubles of this world. And all mythologies have their utopias, usually set in a golden age at the start of the human story, followed by humanity's fall. The Christian utopia, of course, is the Garden of Eden, Within the tragedy of the expulsion, with the tragedy of the expulsion, came the promise of paradise regained. Science's contribution to this mythology was to make perfection seem feasible in this life. You didn't have to wait for the afterlife. A famous mythical utopia reflecting the dream of not having to work was the mythical land of cocaine. Now, it's spelled Cocayne. I'm not sure what there may be a connection between the land and the drug, I don't know. But the mythical land of cocaine dates from the 13th century. Work was forbidden. Everything needed for life was to hand with minimal effort. The rivers flowed with oil, milk, honey, and wine, the trees with abundant low-lying fruit. The body was freed for the delights of love. This is how the Garden of Eden has always been imagined. Hence the promise of machines. Machines would liberate sex from bondage and make the rivers flow with Coca-Cola. A vision which ran all the way from classical times to the Freudian Marxists of the 1960s. However, social scientists had a rather different dream of utopia, which had nothing to do with drinking Coca-Cola, but with creating a perfect society. This is the dream explored by John Passmore in his book, The Perfectibility of Man. And he makes a distinction that is vital to understand how this dream evolved, and that is between two versions of the dream, which he calls task perfection and social perfection. By task perfection, he means perfection in doing tasks. A perfect criminal, for example, is one who never gets caught. I mean, that is task perfection. But that doesn't make him her a perfect human, nor a society composed of perfect criminals, a perfect society. Being human, Passmore points out, is not a profession, nor can a perfect society be defined as one which performs its social tasks perfectly, because it's society which sets the tasks. And I think with the coming of machines, social perfection came to be defined increasingly in terms of task perfection. That is, in terms of instrumental efficiency. The question of which tasks are worth doing and how they should be done was really parked as too difficult. That was the sphere of morals, and we know we don't agree about that. So the most famous dream of the perfect society comes from Plato. In Book 7 of the Republic, Socrates asks us to imagine people chained from childhood to the walls of a cave in such a way as to be able to look only away from the entrance towards the dark recesses of the cave. Behind them, a fire burns, throwing a flickering relief on the walls before them, shadows cast by objects passing behind. They watch these shadows, give them names, and interpret them as real. Now, suppose one of the prisoners, let's call him a philosopher, frees himself, turns his head towards the cave's entrance, and makes his way to it. As the philosopher comes into the sunlight, he will see more and more of the real things, of which the others see only the shadows. Finally, in full sunlight, he sees things as they really are, perfect forms, of which the senses deliver only distorted impressions. And among these perfect forms is the perfect city. Well, you can read Plato as a polemic against the dysfunctions of Athenian democracy, and there are lots of things there which are very extraordinary and have had a great influence. But I only want to mention one point. The philosophers are the rulers, and their rule is to be secured both by breeding and by education. Education of the guardian class was to be centered on music, philosophy, and mathematics, with gymnastics thrown in, because they had to be protected, these rulers, and you needed soldiers, an auxiliary class. And interestingly, Plato excluded imaginative art, tragedy, and comedy from his educational curriculum, because they fostered emotional and not rational parts of the soul. And poets were to be banished from the city altogether. Now, standing in the way of this perfect city was one terrible obstacle, which was created by Christianity. And that was the doctrine of original sin. In the story, the Genesis story, Adam and Eve were created innocent, like all other living things, but God singled out humans from the rest of his creation by giving them free will. Adam and Eve knew they should not eat from the tree of knowledge, but willfully corrupted their innocence by, well, it was corrupted by the serpent, but of course they chose to follow the serpent. For this offense, all humans were banished from the Garden of Eden. And St. Augustine, who is the real originator of the doctrine of original sin in its full force, wrote in the Confessions, in his Confessions, I was quite sure that it was better for me to give myself up to your love, God's love, than surrender to my own lust. But while I wanted to follow the first course, I was a slave to the pleasures of the second. So that seemed an obstacle to the perfect city. I mean, here were, right, reason might tell you what to do and how to organize it, but passions, the human passions, original sin, would always get in the way of this creation. So anyway, by many tortuous routes, this debate just went on throughout the Middle Ages, well, with original sin really in the ascendant, until it was sort of swept away by science and the Enlightenment, and they abolished original sin between them. So let me just come to the scientific method, because the scientific method, which really I think dates from about the 16th, 17th century, measure what can be measured and make measurable what cannot be measured. Economists will understand that idea very well, but it is the basis of science and the claims of science, by the way. And that was Galileo. The scientific line runs from Copernicus to Kepler, Galileo, and Newton. And in the spirit of Plato, Copernicus wondered what the universe would look like from the sun rather than the earth, and concluded that it would show that the earth revolved around the sun, not the other way around. His hypothesis was confirmed by telescopes, Kepler and Galileo, and the question of what kept the planets in orbit, that is not flying off, either crashing into the earth or flying off into the sky, was answered by Newton and his theory of gravity. All of this you learn early in science classes, but it was an absolute revolution when this heliocentric view of the world was first established in the 17th century. And Newton wasn't anti-religious. He felt he had simply discovered the mechanism by which God acted on nature. This meant, though, that if we understood the laws of nature, we could bend nature to our will as humans. We could become sort of godlike in a way. And first we discover nature's laws, then devise the machinery to make it work. And so this brings me back to my first lecture where, the first idea of tools and machines was imitating nature, looking at nature, seeing how the bird flies, and then thinking we could develop wings. That was the very early idea, but gradually it gave way to the idea that nature was something we could overcome, master, bend to our purposes. We didn't have to imitate it. We knew better than nature. And then just to continue the scientific history a little bit, the Renaissance philosopher Francis Bacon made empiricism the basis of the scientific method. Look and see replaced the medieval see and look. The telescope would replace the scriptures as the source of knowledge of God's works. I mean, it's a very important distinction. Look and see, not look and see, not see and look. The medieval idea was you saw in your mind, like Plato. You saw God, and then you looked and found confirmation in nature. But this idea reversed it. You actually went out and looked at what was going on, and then came to the view of you developed a theory. Economics, interestingly, is a very Platonic. It's always been a very Platonic discipline. It's based on models, and the trouble is, a lot of economists do confuse models and reality. Well, we then go through this idea. What is it that if you have a heliocentric world, God? I mean, you think, okay, God may have started it all off, but you can hardly intervene in this world, which is only a tiny fragment of the cosmos. And the poet Shelley put it very well. It's impossible to believe that the spirit which pervades this infinite machine begat a son upon the body of a Jewish woman. So they started a process, Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler, by which earthly affairs were gradually prized from God's hands. And he became irrelevant to the conversation. Yeah, he was there at the beginning of everything. Fine. No problem with that. But the idea that he sent his son, begat of a woman to save this world. Why would God be that interested in our world? I mean, he had bigger affairs to concern himself with. So gradually God was removed from the conversation. For our purposes in this lecture series, I think the metaphor which is most useful was that the earth was a giant clock wound up by God. And this suggested to Descartes that humans were the wheels, pumps, and springs of the divine clockmaker. One could aspire to make society work, just as one could make a clock work. The mechanical metaphor was especially seductive because it introduced a vocabulary for discussing human society in terms of frictions. Again, a term familiar to economists. The problem with markets is frictions. If you could get rid of the frictions, you'd have perfect markets. And so the whole language of physics was taken over by the social scientists, and those who dreamt of perfecting society, this great machine of society, responsible for all the crimes, follies, misfortunes of the world. You just get it right, and you've got utopia, you've got perfection. It seemed very easy. All you had to do was learn its laws. And we already knew some of its laws. We already knew the laws of nature. We knew more and more of the laws of nature. And, society was part of nature, after all, because it was filled with natural objects, humans. So I think this is the development that we want to follow. What exactly was it that one was supposed to see when one looked? Well, according to the empiricists, it was seeing an apple fall to the ground, which led Newton to his eureka moment. But this is one of the great myths of science, isn't it? Newton could never arrive at his law of gravity by seeing apples fall to the ground, something which had been observed, presumably, for thousands of years, if not millions, without arousing any curiosity. No. What the falling apple might have done was to suggest to Newton a hypothesis to explain its fall. By this time, they were into developing hypotheses about nature. Empirical testing of scientific intuition, then, has been the hallmark of the scientific method ever since. But let me say, every single scientific theory is underdetermined by the evidence. It always is ahead of the evidence. You don't see stuff around and then come to a general law. It never works that way. But that's the mythology of science. Now, as I've said before, scientists were not in principle against authority. It was the authority of religion that they were against. They were quite happy with their own authority. And because what they saw, what the scientists saw, scientists counted as knowledge, and knowledge was what they were offering. And Francis Bacon wrote a utopian fable called New Atlantis. Date 1624, loosely modeled on Plato's Republic. And in it, an elite of scientists rules. Scientific research into the causes of things is concentrated on in the seat of government, Solomon's house. Its scientists and technicians have complete intellectual freedom, but it is they who decide which of their discoveries to publish and apply and which to keep secret. New Atlantis' capital, Bensalem, is in fact ruled by a technocracy of scientists and engineers. As a result, it is pious and chaste. Those are his words. And Bacon's utopia links science to one of our deepest dreams, better health. Solomon's house was a pharmacopoeia of medical enhancements, prolongation of life, restitution of youth, delay of age, alleviation of disease, mitigation of pain, improvement of complexion, stature and looks, enhancement of sexual prowess and medical capacity. It even included the military use of poisons. So that was the utopia of 1624. How much of it has come to pass? An interesting question. And the other thing about Bacon is he ruled out the possibility of democratic knowledge, because knowledge he regarded as naturally scarce. Land might be redistributed in acre plots and all that sort of thing, as socialists would like, but knowledge can't be parceled out in bits, because it is bound to reside with the minority of experts who understand how things work. And Bacon understood this well enough himself. The authoritarian moral of his fable is well brought out by the historian of science, Stephen Shapin. And I quote, "If experience was to play its foundational role in a reformed and orderly natural philosophy, it had to be controlled, monitored, and disciplined, like I think Elon Musk aims to do. If untutored sense was likely to mislead, then ways had to be found to regulate what experience could properly ground philosophic reflection. The question of what experience encompassed judgments about whose experience. In other words, a boundary needed to be established between what counted as knowledge and what didn't. A boundary policed by a gatekeeper. Observation had to be cooked by experts before it could be served up for social use. Like priests, science claimed power based on expertise. And the only thing that changed was the type of expertise that they offered. I mean, no longer priestly expertise or theological expertise, but scientific expertise. It's telling that the new sciences of the 16th and 17th century completely discounted what would now be called folk wisdom as unempirical, too local, and, to use Hayek's phrase, too tacit to count properly as knowledge. It's interesting, economists will know this story about Hayek rejected central planning because he thought too much knowledge was tacit and a central planner would never be able to gather it, consolidate it, and to use it as the basis of a plan that fitted human purposes. And another person who's also emphasized this aspect of knowledge as power is, of course, Michel Foucault. So all of those who see the social media as liberating knowledge from power, and many do, should understand the highly asymmetric nature of most people's relationship with platforms. Asymmetric relationship. So now, the first actual utopia in the way we think of utopia was the utopia of Sir Thomas More, dating from 1526. He was a Christian, and he was later executed. He was a leading Catholic in England, later executed by an ungrateful king. And as a philosophical and political project, utopia, of course, as we've seen, goes back to Plato. But by the late 15th century, voyages of discovery and the freedom to imagine life in unexplored lands provided the necessary impetus to the revival of the idea of utopia. In the beginning, all was America, wrote the English philosopher John Locke. There it was, all was America, because the imagination could wander over this unexplored terrain and devise its own dreams of how it might be organized. And this was so in the double sense. The New World offered stimulus to the imagination, and fresh land for the colonists. The colonialist rendition of European history starts with, as we know, Christopher Columbus. But you've got to understand utopia in terms of discovery of America, mainly America. And you have Thomas More's Utopia in 1526. So what is it? I don't know how many of you have read at any time More's Utopia, but it's a traveler's tale. It's the standard format. The traveler stumbles upon a hitherto unknown land and gives a realistic account of the customs and habits of its inhabitants, which contrasts favorably with the deplorable arrangements of their own country. I mean, that's the way the trope works. More's was a social ideal. His purified Christian commonwealth stood against both the corrupt indulgence of Catholicism and the private property regime which evolved in Tudor England. Merchants wallowing in luxury and moral laxity contrasted with the dearth of victuals, vagrancy, rising crime, and increasingly cruel punishments. I mean, that was More's sort of contrast with his own country. And here was the utopia, which would be far better, where the traveller observes to provide everyone with some means of livelihood so that nobody is under the frightful necessity of becoming a thief and then a corpse. That was how he just sort of implied was the state of Tudor England, and utopia was where, like the land of cocaine, none of this would work. And so it had other interesting features. Sufficiency of goods was secured by a central allocation system, which provided every member of the community with food, clothing, housing, education, and medical treatment, with the result that working hours were shortened, opening up time for prayer and contemplation. State functions were reduced to what Marx would later call, or was it Lenin, the administration of things. There's no politics. Crime existed, but the demands on the judiciary and penal system were very minimal, very law-abiding. Public hospitals, plentiful common meals, and relative freedom of movement seemed to ensure widespread content. This is quoting from Utopia. Well, the appeal of More's utopia to socialists in later centuries is obvious. I mean, they all admired More's utopia and saw it as a kind of model. And add machinery to More's social system, and a communist utopia starts to become feasible. At the same time, one can see why More's utopia arouses the same dystopian reflection as communism later did. Everyone has enough to eat, but everything is uniform, standardized. One can't travel freely without a permit. More's identical houses prefigure the mass fabricated Soviet cities. Leisure is made considerably less attractive by compulsory attendance at lectures. Since everyone is watching everyone else, there are no lurking holes or secret meeting places. So it was a model, it was for some a model, a blueprint. For libertarians, its compulsory austerity and social control mechanisms gave it a distinctly inhuman character. Now let's go to the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that dominated Western Europe, particularly from about the middle of the 18th century onwards. Maybe it starts earlier. Maybe Newton might be the first major Enlightenment figure, but it wasn't primarily a movement of scientists, but a movement of philosophers and people interested in politics. If it had a single credo, it was that knowledge would free people from the control of priests. And this would enable them to identify, and I'm quoting from one of the Enlighteners, enable them to identify the best route to health, wealth, and the betterment of the human condition. The central Baconian tradition identified reason with science. Since scientific knowledge was cumulative, you'd never go back to square one. Advances in science would therefore guarantee progress in all departments of human life. They had essentially a linear view of history, at the apex of which was perfection. But progress could be seen as you looked at history over thousands of years. Well, I think the Enlighteners abolished original sin. They said original sin. Humans are naturally good. But what was the original sin of the Enlightenment? I think it was that its belief that laws governing human behavior, as Auguste Comte put it, as definite as those determining the fall of the apple. Social science was simply a juvenile branch, an adolescent branch of natural science, rendered so not by any difference of method, but by the complexity of the material. But that would be overcome. Social science would also grow to maturity and would finally start to rival the already magnificent achievements of natural science. Here is Batsarov in Turgenev's Father and Children, a novel in which the hero or anti-hero typically captures the spirit of the Enlightenment. We know approximately what physical diseases come from, says Batsarov. Moral diseases come from bad education, from all the nonsense people's heads are stuck with from childhood, from the defective state of society. In short, reform society and there will be no diseases. Now, what's wrong with that? I mean, I'm describing something, but what's wrong with it? I think what's wrong with it is that it ignores the palpably reflexive character of social science. The fact that humans are both subject and object. The fall of an apple doesn't depend on the apple's wishes. All apples on a branch which is shaken fall to the ground. The apple's intentions have nothing to do with it. But that's not true of the shaking of individuals and nations. They don't all fall to where they're expected to. There was never any guarantee or even likelihood that the new generation of secular shepherds would agree on a new religion of humanity for their disturbed flocks, or that even if they did, their flocks would follow them. So there were three enlightenments, and they all shared this general idea of a linear progress, but they nevertheless were very, very different in their approaches. They're the French Enlightenment, the French philosophes, and they were most comprehensively committed to the identification of progressive science. And people like Voltaire, Turgot, and Condorcet in particular are representatives of that mood. Condorcet was an early believer that statistics would solve all social problems. Provided you had enough statistics, you would be able to affect society. And then you get the Scottish Enlightenment, which was the second branch. And I want to spend a tiny bit more time on that because it wasn't as radical as the French version. British institutions, by common consent, were already superior to those of any other advanced country. The British, having had their glorious revolution in 1649, when they cut off the head of their king. So British thinkers could see the progress of society more in evolutionary terms, without the need for deliberate and possibly violent acts of state. And this is what enabled David Hume to claim complacently that political practice should be guided by custom and prudence, because he thought those were actually the political practices of the progressive British society of his day. Reason, wrote Hume. Hume's a difficult. He's an extraordinarily interesting because he's very important in economics. The whole balance of trade theory comes out of David Hume in the 18th century. But reason, he thought, is and ought to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. Now, at first sight, that sort of seems to be a vindication of original sin, doesn't it? I mean, reason ought to be the slave of the passion. But remember, he identifies the passions with reason, not with St. Augustine's lusts. So what's he doing here? What he's doing is really just saying that the passions are rather good, and they could be made even better with sufficiently good education. Many people were naturally benevolent. They didn't wantonly seek to inflict cruelty and pain on others. They wanted only to be happy and for others to be. If the passions could be tempered by reflection, then love of self need not be at the expense of others. And Adam Smith made this insight the foundation of economics. Freedom of commerce would drain the passions of their poison. And what he did in words famously and endlessly repeated was to dissolve the traditional conflict between egoism and altruism. So all of that was summed up by Adam Smith. If I can get the quotation. Yes. Adam Smith, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. In other words, the pursuit of self-interest, while it could be destructive under conditions of earlier rude societies, could be made benevolent in a system of competitive markets. Markets, of course, subject to the rule of law. A framework of law and regulation to keep markets competitive would turn self-love into a felix culpa, a happy sin. So is it a brilliant conjuring trick, this? And the beauty of this positive interpretation of egoism is that it affirms a principle of order which doesn't rely on people giving orders. By elevating one of the most reprobated human vices, love of money, into a good passion, Adam Smith turned the body into a potential ally of the soul. This undermined the Christian insistence that goodness needed the support of grace. Now, in his book, The Passions and the Interests, Albert Hirschman gives a brilliant account of Smith's conjuring trick. I recommend that book very, very highly. And he says, in the early modern age, man was widely viewed as the stage on which fierce and unpredictable battles were found between reason and passion, or later among the various passions. At mid-18th century, some hope was held out that the interests, which were increasingly understood in the purely pecuniary sense of the term, would be able to tame the disastrous, if aristocratic, passions. And by the latter part of the century, the passions were collapsed into the interests by Adam Smith, which pronounced the great mob of mankind to be safely programmed. And I think in this very unrealism of the Smithian model of the economy lay its great appeal, because it spawned the model of a self-regulating market, spawned an important strand of technological utopianism, which has been very influential, especially in the United States. However, Smith's optimism didn't survive the French Revolution. And this is something we'll come to in a second. But first of all, a word about Rousseau, because he's by far the most attractive of these people, really. Although, yeah. And Romanticism is the third strand. It wasn't invented in the 18th century, Romanticism. It's the universal mode of poetry, expressing the yearning to have more intense experiences. It's not the content of romantic beliefs which mark them out, but the passionate commitment to them, regardless of the consequences, which removes prudence as a virtue. But its spirit, it sought to liberate people from the authority of tradition, but its spirit was contrary to that of the philosophes, in that the liberation it sought was that of feeling, not of reason. It was sparked by the communion with nature and had nothing in common with Hume's identification of civilization with the softening manners of Britain's liberal aristocracy. To Rousseau, natural behavior is behavior stripped of artifice. Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. And he has a very interesting plan of education. He hates the education. This is, attacking the education of the priest, but it's an attack on all education, really, as it's been practiced ever since. In Emile, the child must be kept away from all educators and subjected only to an environment in which their natural feelings could grow. Their good feelings. He never referred actually to humans as noble savages. That comes out of the European encounter with primitives in the 18th century. So then, the noble savage doesn't live in the hunter-gatherer society any longer. It lives in Geneva. So you have to have a social contract, which then develops out of the need to collectivize these good feelings and make them the basis of a constitution. The social contract is very different from that of Locke and the British liberals. Now, my last point. You come to the French and Industrial Revolutions. Here, everything is very, very sunny, and that's not how the 18th century ends. First of all, you have the extreme violence of the French Revolution, followed by the Revolutionary Wars, and then you have the extreme violence and horrors of the early factory system. And these two images of what the idea of perfecting society really means in practice gave rise to the first and most famous dystopian novel, and that is Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley. It's an very interesting, it's antecedent, because she was married to Percy Bryce Shelley, the famous poet, and he envisaged a completely different liberation of Prometheus. His great poem was called Prometheus Unbound. But no, she says, hey, wait a minute. This is what Prometheus Unbound is really going to look like. She was about 21 at the time, real genius. And so the novelist's protagonist is Victor Frankenstein. He's a medical doctor skilled in the surgery of dissection, who seeks to learn how to create life from inanimate matter. He's an idealist. He wants to just make humanity perfect. His creature, that is the monster, who's never given a name, by the way, is assembled from parts of dead bodies and bits of skin, and is galvanized by electricity. This was just the beginning of electricity coming in. It was known as galvanism. They didn't know what it was, but that was the term for it. His rapid growth from birth to adulthood is meant to recapitulate the evolution of human life. And so in conceiving him, Mary Shelley drew both on the traditional literature of animated puppets and automated robots, and on the new materialist science, in which consciousness is a byproduct of matter. But the creature never attains to his promised goodness. Early on, Victor Frankenstein is motivated in his scientific endeavors by a mixture of ambition and humanitarianism. I quote, "What glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death." But as the novel progresses, this is Frankenstein, the doctor, becomes possessed by a demonic hunger for power over nature. "With unrelaxed and breathless eagerness, I pursue nature to her hiding place. A new species would bless me as its creator and source." Artificial intelligence there, very, very obviously. "Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child as completely as I would deserve theirs." Frankenstein. That's what his monster was going to lead to. Well, the creature, as we know, or those who know the story know, turns into a killing machine. It's hideous to look at. It turns on its creator and goes on a rampage. And in the end, I just can't remember how it ends, but I think Frankenstein has to kill it off finally. So why did she write it then? Well, it's because think of the date, 1820. You had the French Revolution. You had the terrific violence of the French Revolution, as well as its achievements. And you had the factory system, the horrors of the factory system. So how could this dream really be valid, of Prometheus Unbound? It signified the death of naive utopianism. But the quest for perfection, of course, wasn't abandoned, as we know, and we'll meet it again in the next lecture, The Dream of Artificial Intelligence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we do have some time for questions. So please just raise your hand and I'll pass the microphone, or one of us will pass the microphone so you can ask your question. Everyone is just gathering their strength. Yes.
Yes.
So speak up, and if I don't hear you properly, someone will tell me what you said.
Sure. I will probably stand up, and thank you for this lecture. And my name is Yevhen, and I'm coming from the country that you predicted would fall to bits. Luckily, that you predicted which would fall to bits a couple of years ago. Luckily, it didn't happen. And my question would be connected to that because of the uncertainty, and the world that is around us is still full of violence that you just raised the question. Do you see the place for utopia nowadays?
No.
And for dystopia?
It's a busted flush. It's very, very hard to, well, put it this way. I haven't abandoned faith in progress. In other words, I don't believe that history just return and return. Do a lot of things better, then it will collapse. Start again. And that was the traditional view of history until the idea of progress got entrenched. So I think there is something, something in progress. But what I don't really deal with in this lecture, but it's in my book, so I haven't got time for it. And that is the idea that progress depends on catastrophe. It always has. It's not linear. It's not that you just move. Science is linear. I mean, it's very hard to think of going back to believing some of the things people believed, scientists so-called, 500 years ago. It's unless knowledge is destroyed, which it could happen. There seems to be an internal cumulative movement in science. They work that way. Let's take one or two obvious. Why do you think we've got the European Union? Because all these very enlightened people said, oh, well. That is the extreme event, without which there would be no European Union. So, and we can go through, why do we have the welfare state? Because the first time and again, extreme events took this sort of enlightenment of the mind. Marx believed that violence could get to socialist utopia. So the devil, now I go back to the theology of the original sin, the devil has always been a hard-working member of the army of progress. You can, if you want to put it that way. So I think we will have quite a lot of catastrophes waiting along the route. Keynes wrote an essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. I think there will be lots of pain for our grandchildren, my grandchildren, maybe yours, before we get to the next peak, if you like.
Okay, just please raise your hand if you have a question. Yes.
Hello, thank you.
I wish I could hear you better. I don't think microphone. There is non-communication. It's a bit better. If I don't hear someone will.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation and for the lecture. I think, my name is Ildar Daminov. I'm a PhD student in political science here. And speaking of critical junctures and the catastrophes, do you think that even if we discuss what progress is, and if there is progress, does it have to be necessarily driven by sort of catastrophes and negative critical junctures? Or do you think technological critical junctures, which are usually seen as positive, could be labeled as solutionist, and at the end of the day also become, in a way, negative critical junctures? So like with artificial intelligence today.
Yeah, well, I'm going to touch on that in my next lecture. I mean, the first of all, on the theory of catastrophe, one of the interesting developments in the last 30 or 40 years is how the scientists and the writers have, come to the same view of things. I mean, the scientists were always the optimists. They always believed things were going to get better. And the poets and others, starting with Rousseau, were always the pessimists. Now they all agree. If you all modern fiction is dystopian, and all scientific prophecy is dystopian. Do you ever see the I know, is it the doom clock, which the nuclear physicists have set up, ticking away to Armageddon? They started at 7 minutes and now it's 60 seconds. And of course the climate change science points in the same direction. You have Bacon's ideas of manufactured poisons. Many contemporary illustrations of that in biology, particularly. So there is a sort of agreement there, but does it have to end at that point? I mean, does the human adventure come to an end? No, No, I don't think it does. But you've got to become aware. You've got to be aware of what's happening. And I think this is where thought does play a part in just raising awareness of where we are, what these events mean in the big scheme, and also not putting all our eggs in the scientific basket. I mean, there's a lot more to the life than just creating scientific algorithms. Because if you do that, and if you think you can manage society as a big machine, the disasters will be bigger than they need to be. I think one thing I've also left out of my lectures is this huge return to barbarism in Germany in the 1930s. And that was a return to barbarism. And they were using technology in order to create their utopia, their idea of utopia, which was a barbarian utopia. It was based on the forest and all kinds of things of that kind. So it's all there. And the other thing is, why do people go on killing each other all over the world? I mean, one of the news programs I'm addicted to when I'm in Vienna is Al Jazeera, and every time I turn it on, there's another civil war. There are more hundreds of people being killed in Sudan. I mean, it's not the Enlightenment vision of where we should be at this point in time. Why we're not there and how it differs between different regions of the world is a very, very important question.
Yes, hi, my name is Marcus Kreutzer. I'm a visiting faculty here. So you tell this story of this utopia as a sort of kind of a dialectic between utopias and dystopias and sort of going back and forth. And so we get multiple iterations of different utopias. What would you say has the challenge, the balance between utopian and dystopian thinking changed over time? That is, in the modern age with the idea of progress, is utopia more widely, more deeply entrenched in dystopian thinking than it was in earlier iterations?
Well, of course, utopia means, again, we have a language problem. Literally, utopia means nowhere. It can either be utopia or dystopia, but we think of one as positive and the other as negative. Utopian literature was very prominent in parts of the 19th century. For example, the great utopian fiction writer was H.G. Wells, and his science fiction was all looking forward. Titles like Men Like Gods, and it all looked forward to a superior human race. By the time of his death, 1945, his last book was called Mind at the End of Its Tether. He had abandoned it all. He couldn't assimilate the horrors of the Second World War to his vision of men like gods, right? So the answer is you get dystopia dominating from the beginning of the 20th century, and the great three dystopian trilogies are Brave New World, 1984, and the Russian Zamyatin's We. They are the essence of what the first half of the 20th century saw the future as.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have reached the end of our time, so I suggest we take all our other questions to the reception and we can keep discussing there. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you again for the talk.
Thank you. Okay. I have to give you my things, don't I? Shall I take them? You take them for me. This time I'm going to get to the drinks cupboard. I mean, the drinks
should
table.
come right away.
quickly.
Just don't jump here.
No, I'm not going to jump. Here we go. Are we
Thank you.
okay?
Thank
And I'll just get my jacket.